I am so thrilled to be here today. We are talking about Goal 4 during Ideagen's 17 Days of Sustainability. And Goal 4 is ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. And I am so thrilled not only by this topic, but also by our panelist and featured presenter for today. She is the world's expert on this subject, and I am so thrilled to introduce Dr. Frederika Reisman and bring her up to the virtual stage. So as she comes up to the stage, I'll ask her just to share a little bit more about her work and what she does and what she's been involved in, and then we'll get to our discussion questions for today.
Well, my interest in research has been in supporting new teachers as they enter the teaching profession, as well as supporting corporate trainers, talent managers, so that they can understand the needs of the people who report to them and who come to them for workshops. We have just started the Frederika Reisman Center for Translational Research in Creativity and Motivation. And that was created through a $1.5 million grant donated to Drexel for that purpose. And the vision of the center is to give access of the important research in creativity and innovation to the end users, teachers, and corporate trainers, because the research resides in journals or books, and the end users don't have access to it. So the purpose of the center is to bridge that gap. I also am interested in applying creativity to dyscalculia, and this past year with a colleague in special ed at Drexel, we did a book applying creativity to help those with dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, twice exceptional, and we're very excited about that. Also, we've just contracted with Cambridge University Press to do a book that will support the Translational Research Center, where in the book we define what translational research is and have chapters getting at the foundation and the trailblazers in creativity and in innovation. We will be bringing teachers K through 16 as part of the new center, who will help us give feedback to lesson plans that we will develop, and they'll, I'm sure, modify those lesson plans and become part of our family, developing lesson plans and lessons and activities that will benefit their students. We also are going to have a major evaluation piece, because although it's wonderful to have the teachers improve their skills and learn more about creativity, but unless there's an effect on the learner, on the students, their students, then what's the use? So we're going to include changes in the students' happiness, willingness to learn, feeling good about themselves, feeling that they can do things as part of the evaluation.
I love that approach because it's so multi-pronged. And I want to go back to a few things you said. One of them is kind of expanding who has access to the research and how that group of people uses the research. And so when we look at teacher training, when we look at maybe even some of the assessments that we use to assess learners, and we think, well, if they just fill in some multiple choice questions or take this test or check this box, well, they know the material, that's fine. I love as we get a little deeper into discussion. I know we're going to peel back some of the layers here, but I'd love for you to share a little bit more about some of the projects that you've been involved in as they relate to advancing Goal 4. So maybe kind of drilling down a little bit. I know you mentioned working within the classroom with teachers. How does that work accomplish Goal 4? Ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting that lifelong learning?
Well, I think that question relates to what I'd like to focus on today, which is intellectual and emotional abuse of K-12 students and teachers due to standardized testing. There is a lot of research that shows that disadvantaged youngsters do not benefit from standardized testing. In fact, they, as well as most students, are harmed by it because these tests, if you're from a rich family and you can have tutors and a lot of resources, that's a very different input to taking the tests than the children from lower income, from racial minorities. And so there's a movement nationally to get rid of the standardized tests now. And one of the main goals is to get rid of the inequity that they cause.
Bringing up some key points here with if you have access to resources, well, you're looking at a very different output on a standardized test than if you simply didn't have access to those resources. And at the end of the day, that education gap by way of just that one filter of a test is now increasing and increasing and increasing. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on when we say the term standardized test, what do we really mean? What does that really mean in the field?
A test is standardized when all the students taking the test respond to the same set of questions and is administered and scored in a predetermined standard manner. This allows making statistical comparisons among groups of students, teachers, schools, and school districts.
And I think as you've defined it, this sets up this notion that we can compare everybody universally, and it does not include kind of that very personal nature of how an individual learns. And that's extremely concerning to people, I think, like both of us, who are advocates for creativity in the field, for personalized learning, for exploring a little bit more than, okay, your education is 3 multiple choice tests. And I know we're both not saying that, but I think when we think about our shifting economy over the past few years, even over 2020 even, we've got to be thinking about how we're training the next generation to think creatively, to embed creativity and innovation in all we do. And so I'd love, before we get into that dialogue, are there any pros to standardized testing? Or is there a trade-off, or what's a little bit more we can comment on?
Well, I think I'd like to talk about why standardized testing is good and bad. And I will incorporate what you've just asked me to talk about in this idea of standardized testing has both good and bad sides. A standardized testing has substantial effects on schools and the teaching and learning process. Standardized tests have been shown to be a major cause of student stress. Another major issue is its failure to address inequity. Standardized tests are not set up to consider any of a student's personal circumstances, such as their family life, their mental health, or simply how well they do with a sit-down exam. If a student performs poorly on a standardized test, they can face increased pressure from their parents and peers to do better. This can lead to students resenting learning and believing that they are worse than everyone else because of their low test score. Standardized tests also do not take into account other factors that are unique to each student, such as their mental health, family life, socioeconomic status. Often, students from wealthier households have higher scores because of tutors and programs to which poorer students might not have access. And this leads to inequality of test results and an increased rate of wealthier students accepted into colleges, even when they are not necessarily smarter than less affluent students. Unfortunately, the chief indicator by which most communities judge a school staff success is student performance on standardized tests. If a school's standardized test scores are high, people think the school staff is effective. If a school's standardized test scores are low, they see the school staff as ineffective. These evaluations may be harmful as they affect funding, community view of their schools, effectiveness, teacher and administration, their reputation, and student self-concept. Now, some suggest that standardized testing is a productive policy tool that focuses schools on important standards and similarly encourages educators to focus their instructional programs and time on valued skills. However, others say that the pressure corrupts and that pressure to focus on test results has caused teachers to distort their curriculum, substitute meaningful instruction with educationally trivial exercises and worksheets that drill students, and engage in various cheating strategies to inflate test scores. Disadvantaged students often get less attention to science, art, thinking skills, and enrichment content, and specifically included in standardized tests. Some would say that the pressure to score well has encouraged schools to stop focusing on student learning, and instead the focus is on improving students' performance on the test. Standardized tests should be reevaluated to see whether their use is really worth all the harm that they do to students, such as replacing their normal learning habits. Now, at the post-secondary level, many colleges are making the SAT and ACT tests optional, with more colleges taking this approach each year. If colleges do not require these tests, then there should be no reason for students to still be taking them since they cause so much stress and harm. Standardized tests are at risk of causing students to lose the original purpose of learning for learning's sake. We should rethink whether these tests are still worth taking. Slogans like, "We cannot fix what we do not measure," might sound nice, but they really don't help teachers and education officials make decisions about how to use test results in a way that feels clear and important to the public at large. To those who agree that the tests represent meaningful learning and instruction, results suggest that standardized testing is a productive policy tool. It focuses schools on important standards and similarly encourages educators to focus their instructional programs on time and valued skills.
And I love this foundation that you're laying out for us, because I think there are so many nuances to education, and to get us back to kind of a society almost where we're learning for the sake of learning, where we prioritize intellectual curiosity, that same curiosity that spurs an entrepreneur to action, or perhaps maybe a ninth grader who is unsure of what route they might want to pursue. Maybe that question is a false barrier, and it sets them up for a false sense of, I have to choose now, rather than saying, why can't I explore all of the topics out there? Math, art, English, science, all the different topics that develop ultimately a robust individual who can contribute to society in a personal and meaningful way. And I think in many ways, we get a little blinded by saying, well, standardized tests are the panacea. They're the silver bullet. They're going to solve everything and we can measure everything. But I think is a large part of what you're saying is, hold on, wait a second. What are they actually measuring? Are they actually useful for teachers who are promoting education, not schooling, education,
Right.
who are cultivating lifelong learners? And I think you mentioned a little earlier the evaluation piece of the Translational Research Center. And I think that that's so meaningful, because we also are discovering what it looks like inside our brains when we learn. And so to couple that science with evaluation in meaningful ways, I think will give us a clearer picture of how we can create and ensure more inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learners.
Right.
So,
Now, of course, there's a political aspect to this whole situation. And although President Biden, as a senator for Delaware, voted for the No Child Left Behind Act that instituted new grade level standard exams, the former vice president indicated that he now opposed mandatory standardized testing. He said that testing took authority away from teachers, who deserve to be given the authority to determine what happens in their classroom, and that tests did not capture the ability for teachers to motivate students to learn and gain confidence. Now, some states were proactive in regard to eliminating standardized testing. The District of Columbia got approval to cancel the English, language arts, and math exams required by federal law. The U.S. Department of Education refused to let school districts substitute locally chosen exams for statewide ones, on the grounds that the ability to use statewide tests to compare results between schools and districts is crucial. Yet other decisions by the department appeared in opposition to this argument. For example, the department waived the federal requirement that at least 95% of eligible students take the annual exam, thus making the comparisons void. Now, New Jersey, with the department's approval, decided to shorten tests or delay testing. And California effectively empowered districts to decide whether to give annual state exams based on local conditions without actually receiving a federal waiver. In March 2020, when the pandemic took hold, there was an unexpected shout of joy rippling across every state in the US. The Department of Education announced it will not enforce standardized testing requirements. Debate about the long-term fate of the tests intensified. after the U.S. Department of Education said it would not grant states blanket waivers from the exams like they received in 2020. Top congressional Democrats for education policy, alongside some advocacy groups, pushed to maintain the testing requirements. Although President Biden indicated that he opposed mandatory standardized testing during his 2020 presidential campaign. Many stakeholders have been wanting standardized testing to lose some of its emphasis and benefit to multi-billion-dollar corporations who make the tests and score the tests. And there are now signals that this decision to cancel standardized testing due to the pandemic, homeschooling, and distance learning may provoke change.
And I love what you're saying here, because we're at a point in our society, I think the past year has accelerated, where we've got to discover alternative ways to evaluate learning. And so I'd love for you to, I know you have so many great strategies that you have used, not just with peers, but also with your own students, with teachers, to help shape their understanding of what other ways there are to assess learning than only the standardized test.
And there are many. Because of the COVID epidemic, the U.S. Education Department is letting states cancel standardized tests. And the move is a practical one. School buildings across the nation have been closed due to the epidemic, the pandemic. As a result, 2020 was the first year without federally mandated standardized testing in nearly 2 decades. With standardized testing canceled, teachers finally have the space to be creative. They can design outdoor learning experiences, use project-based learning, and give writing prompts that are personal and meaningful. Teachers can focus on creating curriculum that does more than just prepare students for a test. For many courses of varying format and size across many disciplines, reasonable alternatives to traditional tests, that is paper-based, true, false, or multiple choice, exist. In fact, oftentimes the alternatives may be advantageous to promote learning and be more authentic in terms of students demonstrating what they have learned at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy that includes creativity, synthesis, analysis, and evaluation. And some examples of alternative ways of evaluating include a paper instead of a test. A standard alternative to a test, the paper, takes many forms. The paper should be integral to selected class content and not simply an add-on. Another strategy is a series of quizzes or chapter tests instead of a comprehensive high-stake test. And this involves a series of shorter tests throughout the year. There's also a memorandum or briefing. For older students, prepare a 1 or 2 page memorandum on briefing with, for example, the following headings: background, problem, possible solutions with pros and cons, final recommendation, and you can add as you like, but you see that that opens up the thinking that the students have to engage in. And they give final recommendations with implications, possible impact, and so on. Besides being a good exercise in synthesizing material, it's an excellent way for students to practice being concise and direct. Professional presentations could be applicable to many fields in the form of, let's say, an expert witness presenting material. For example, making a presentation arguing for the inclusion of certain books in the school library, but they have to base that on a rationale. Annotated anthology is where students prepare a selection of works they have read during the term as a thematic analogy. For example, they create the theme, choose the works, write a paragraph, introduction to each, and introduction to the anthology. Now, if the works themselves are short, for example, poems, they can be included. But for longer pieces, just a table of contents, the introduction, and the introduction to each piece is fine. And such an assignment might be in lieu of a final exam or for use as an in-class assignment. Poster sections are very popular, especially with peer critiques. A poster session may take the form of an infographic, which is a collection of imagery, charts, and minimal text that gives an easy to understand overview of a topic. Infographics use striking, engaging visuals to communicate information quickly and clearly. And the steps to create one involve: one, outline the goals for creating your infograph. Two, collect data for your infograph. Three, make data visualizations for your infograph. Four, create your layout using an infographic template. And last, add style to your infograph to make it stand out. Now, in our creativity courses, we have gone to using infographics rather than the midterm exam, where students show the connection of what they've learned thus far in the course expressed as an infogram, and they are so creative. An annotated portfolio is another way of evaluation. Portfolios in place of a test involve students compiling their best or representative work, write a critical introduction to the portfolio, and a brief introduction to each piece. There's annotated research bibliography with an introduction, and this involves recommendation, implication, possible impact, and so on. And besides being a good exercise in synthesizing material, it's an excellent way for students to practice being concise and direct. Reflective paper is another way that we can evaluate what students know. Students write a reflective paper critique of an experience tied to class content. Another is an op-ed piece that you might send to a local newspaper. The op-ed piece is a real-world exercise that requires not only a thorough understanding of both an issue, but an ability to understand the audience. I can remember when I was in 8th grade, my English teacher, as an assignment, gave us this challenge to write an op-ed piece. And I wrote one on speed equals death because the week before, 2 of our high school buddies were killed because they crashed their car into a tree going too fast. And it was published in the paper. And I still remember that many decades later. Student proposed projects are another way of evaluating. Students at a predetermined point in the class and with specific conditions tied to it to ensure it will represent their learning as related to the course goals may have the option of suggesting a course project that they would like to undertake. Finally, teachers should always be able to focus on what is most important. They should be able to use their advanced education and immense creativity to design learning experiences that work for their specific students. Now, I would just like to say that many ideas that I have expressed have been triggered by James Poppin, who's emeritus professor at the UCLA Graduate School of Education, and he's a former president of the American Educational Research Association, AERA, and the founding editor of Educational Evaluation and Policy Analysis, which is an AERA quarterly journal. Also, Trevor Muir, who's an educator with a focus on project-based learning, and he runs a Facebook page for the EPIC Classroom. His work is really interesting. And then finally, an article by Herman and Golan entitled The Effects of Standardized Testing on Teachings and Schools, Educational, from the journal Educational Measurement, Issues and Practice. And I would just like to give a shout out to those three people for their good ideas.
Well, and this has been phenomenal. I love how you've laid out all these different alternatives to standardized testing. And as I was listening to you articulate them, I was thinking to myself, these are all so real world based. They allow the teachers to get creative. They allow students to get creative. And more than that, they allow both the teachers and the students to link their own personal, outside of the classroom experiences right into the classroom. And in that way, education becomes not only more accessible, but more personalized, more equitable, because there's a higher buy-in to solving and showcasing your knowledge rather than perhaps regurgitating it on some type of test that doesn't quite mirror real world projects. And so
Exactly.
yes.
And the other thing, many of these strategies support collaborative learning. You've heard me say this in our coursework, that our philosophy is collaboration, not competition. And the standardized testing blocks the students from working together, teaching each other, helping each other. I'll never forget when I was still at the University of Georgia, before I came to Drexel, I was chair of the Division of Elementary Education at Georgia, in Athens, Georgia. And I worked very closely for 12 years with Dr. E. Paul Torrance, who's known as the father of creativity worldwide. And actually, when I left Georgia and came here, Dr. Torrance and I wrote three short books on learning mathematics creatively. And one time when I first got to the university and first met him, he and I went into 2 first grades and gave the Torrance test of creative thinking to the kids. And I gave some of the kids a modified version of Piaget tasks, which shows whether the child can ignore a change in a physical attribute of something. Like, for example, a ball of clay. Is there the same amount of clay if I flatten it or if I make it into a long, thin, snake-like thing? And so those children had to take the Metropolitan Readiness Test. And there were 2 little boys. They were in different classes. And the Metropolitan test. And on the Torrance test of creativity, their score was over 120, which is high. It's like, it's comparable to an IQ 120. That's pretty good. And the 2 teachers said to Dr. Torrance and me, "But those little boys are such liars." And Torrance twinkled and said to them, "But lying is very creative. And now we have to show them how to use their creativity in socially acceptable ways." Well, Dr. Torrance and I worked with the teachers, gave them some strategies, and they started to see these little boys in a different light once they recognized the children's creativity. And they had these boys be coaches and mentors to their classmates and help them in various subject areas, because these 2 boys knew the stuff. They just were creative. They were daydreamers. They couldn't stay in their seats, so they were pinpointed as troublemakers. And that just turned the lives of these two little boys' creativity and the teacher's awareness of their creativity.
And I love that you shared that story, because I keep thinking, for the type of student that is creative, the danger that we have in labeling from the get-go, that could be a totally different trajectory for that student's education and lifelong learning pursuit. And like we've said earlier in the conversation, how damaging is it to link self-worth to whether you got a multiple choice question right, versus having a teacher that says you're creative and armed with one or two strategies can set the child on a whole different trajectory.
Right.
And so I know we've talked a lot about so many great strategies, about so many different ways to promote inclusion and advanced lifelong learning. Is there anything else that comes to mind that maybe in our final minutes here you want to share?
I think it's very important for teachers to be aware of their own creativity, because so often in our classes, at the beginning of the course, so many say, oh, I'm not creative. I never was creative. And we have a free online test. It's called the Reisman Diagnostic Creativity Assessment. And it's a self-report. And self-reports have a lot of problems. People answer like they think they're supposed to answer, but they still are a good instrument. And at the end of the course, the teachers invariably say, I never knew I had these creative strengths. So it's important that teachers be aware of their originality, their fluency, able to generate many ideas, their tolerance of the unknown. We call it tolerance of ambiguity. They're able to resist premature closure. They think in diverse ways, and just so many strengths that they weren't aware of. And unless they're aware of their own creativity and these strengths that are research-based, they really need this knowledge in order to recognize these same strengths in the children. And so I really advocate all of us becoming aware of our own creative strengths.
I love that kind of parting words to end on, because I work in a very innovative and entrepreneurial world. And sometimes I think if I could rewind and teach exactly what you just said 30, 40 years earlier to some of the people I work with, we may just as well achieve the SDGs by now. I think creativity, collaboration, being able to work with people in partnership to accomplish our goals, I think it boils down to recognizing creative strengths if you're a teacher, promoting that for the students in your classroom. And I can't imagine a world in which we don't have creativity. I think, research centers such as the Translational Research Center that you're directing, I think centers like that promote creativity in ways that make it visible for everybody, whether you're a teacher, an administrator, a corporate decision maker, a student. And I think that's the very first step to harnessing the power of our creative potential. So Dr. Reisman, thank you so much for your time, your insights, your expertise. Thank you for all you do to be that ripple effect for people close in Philadelphia, far away as Houston, over in California, across the world through the work that you do. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. Take care.
Thank you, Dr. Galib.